I've given a few silo lectures in my time, and it's always a great pleasure to come back every few years, visit all great faculty in Madison itself, favorite city. So today is going to be kind of a new topics from what I worked on in the past. Okay? But like the through line through everything I talk about today is basically questions of choice. How humans have to reason over multiple alternatives and come down to sort of one decision, and how do we reason about those kinds of things? And so it's going to be a variety of different combinatorial problems. So, since this is Madison, and
your screen's not shared.
Oh. Bad. Okay, good. If you knew any of my work circa 2012, it was probably because of a recommendation service with beer I made. And so I thought it was appropriate to have an example for Madison. So let's say Rob starts a bar, and he needs to choose, say, 10 beers to have on tap. Now, he wants to choose these 10 beers in order to maximize his revenue. And I think his first instinct would be like, okay, I'm going to maybe choose an IPA, a lager, a wheat, and try to cover sort of basis on the styles. And the reason why you might want to do this is because if you had, 3 IPAs, sure, that first IPA is going to cover a lot of people, but maybe that second and third is not going to get as much return as that initial first one. So you want to basically cover all your bases so you can maximize the probability of getting at least one sale from a large group of people with diverse preferences. And so the question is, but how in an online setting where people are coming into your bar every day and you have to make purchases of beer every week, how do you actually do this optimization process in a live form? And how do you set prices of all these beers? And so we're going to look at this problem. And a related problem that really bothers me, I have a few gas stations by my house. They can be off as much as 30 or 40 cents a gallon. And it boggles my mind of how they're actually choosing these prices, because commodity, presumably the costs are the same for these guys. But location is important. And a big question that's very natural is how do they actually set these prices? How do you maximize revenue, and how do you set these prices every day in order to maximize your profit or revenue over time? But also when you go to a gas station, you start to see little deals that come up. It'll be like maybe you go to pay for your gas, and it says, if you buy a car wash, we're going to give you $2 off of that car wash. And so what's implicitly going on here is I'm now choosing, do I want gas for $20, a car wash for $5, or a gas and a car wash for $23? By having these bundles, I can reduce that price, and it can incentivize me to spend a little bit more at this establishment. And it gets me thinking, how did they actually do that? How did they choose which bundles to use and how to price them? And at a gas station, when you've got 3 sort of services, this is not that interesting. But if you're at a grocery store where you've got thousands of SKUs and millions and millions of ways to combine all these things in different prices, how do you actually go about doing this? Because you see these all the time throughout your world. Steve was just commenting on how much he likes Chick-fil-A and how they do their Happy Meals and how do they price them. And most importantly, how do we deal with heterogeneous buyers? So it is not over time you get populations of people. Maybe the news comes out about something. The CEO of Chick-fil-A said something, and maybe he loses Steve as a customer. How do you deal with these buyers that are changing over time with very different preferences? And so this is kind of going to be 2 parts of the talk. Is how do you do bundle optimization or these sort of subset selection in an online way? And how do you do pricing with many products to many buyers? And instead of beer optimization, I'm actually going to be taking an example from antibiotics. So, not familiar, sepsis is an issue where you get bacterial infection inside your blood. And when someone comes into the clinic with bacterial infection in your blood, they have sepsis, you have about 24 to 48 hours to kill this bug, or this person has basically a 50% chance of dying. It's a very, very serious thing. And so to kill this bug, you have to prescribe some antibiotic. And the issue is that there's many types of antibiotics, dozens of antibiotics, and there's many, many different kinds of bugs. Some that are resistant to many kinds of these different antibiotics, because these antibiotics target different mechanisms. Some go after the cell wall, some go after DNA replication. They have different modes of how they work, and they're more or less effective against bugs. The issue is we don't know what bug the person has, right? All we know is that they have an infection in their bloodstream. We know it's bacteria, but we don't know exactly how to go about it. So the natural thing to do is take a blood test and culture the bacteria and try all your different antibiotics on these different bacteria and see which one works the best. It's a great idea. Unfortunately, it takes about 24 hours to culture bacteria. And so by the time you find out what would have worked, it's too late. So you really have to actually make this decision with acting on very little information about what's actually in the blood. The other sort of obvious alternative here is to throw all the antibiotics at it, right? We have 60 antibiotics. Let's just assign all of them and see if that works. Well, that will very effectively kill the bug, but it'll probably also kill the patient because antibiotics can be very toxic in high doses. And if they don't kill you, you may be horribly maimed in the process. And not to mention that if we just willy-nilly give out antibiotics in broad spectrum antibiotics, you're going to really encourage antibiotic resistance on a population level or even an individual level, which can be much, much worse because the rate at which we are acquiring antibiotics is basically going to zero. We need many more antibiotics than we have. So how do we solve this problem? We solve this problem. So Paul Pottinger is the antibiotic steward at UW. And what that means is he is in charge of deciding what drugs to give, what drug cocktail to give on any given day when someone comes into the hospital with sepsis. And how this reads is, give vancomycin or meropenem at some dosage level, give those two together. And then if you have some reason to believe that this patient has some bug or some behavior, maybe add one of these other antibiotics to that cocktail. And then reevaluate in 24 to 48 hours once you have done that blood culture, realize what will work very. But somehow he has to decide what to give to a patient with sepsis when they come in. And how does he do this? And how would you do this as a machine learning researcher or as someone that needs to basically adapt to this online problem, having to keep giving out drugs and try to minimize the number of patients that die? How would you actually do this in an online way? So the way that we're going to model this problem is that we've got n different antibiotics, and to account for toxicity levels, to manage that, we're going to have a limitation on we're only going to be able to prescribe at most K antibiotics at any given time. We don't want to go beyond too many. So like on this last slide, that was a base level of 2 and maybe 3, maybe 4. But so K shouldn't be a large number, but N is quite large, in the many dozens. So at each time, T equals 1 to the big T, patient T arrives, doctor assigns some subset of size K or less than or equal to K. And then we observe the outcome of the patient, whether they get better or they don't get better. Okay? And then this repeats every day. And then we're trying to optimize this subset of drugs potentially in response to changing dynamics. And the objective, of course, is to save as many people as possible.
So here, the amount of antibiotics are not optimized, just selection of antibiotics.
Excellent question. We'll get to dosage levels in a moment. That'll come later. But as a heuristic, I asked Paul this very same question. And basically what he says is, even though European and American standards are different, how we dose these things, he says most of the time we just look at the bottle and we give what it's what is prescribed there. They think of it like as a pill. It's like there is just one dosage. You either combine it or you don't. It is not the intuitiveness of if you have two drugs, maybe you have the dosage of either. That's very intuitive, but that tends to not actually be that big an issue. And so equivalently of maximizing your amount of reward, the amount of lives saved, you're going to minimize regret. So this notion of regret is going to be, we're going to maximize over all subsets of size S, so all subsets S of size K, of maximizing your amount of reward. This is the best you could have gotten in hindsight over all these patients, minus the amount of reward you actually got. So you prescribed an ST every single day. How much reward did you get when you actually prescribed ST every day, versus relative to this best in hindsight, what was the best set after the fact?
One must be sure that I follow the study exactly. We are taking the patients or not? Every day I have a different patient.
Every day we have a different patient.
And when I say that I give to that patient the substance that I have to give, it is actually that I'm giving the full treatment plan. It's not that I will wait to see the same patient next day and I will give again.
That's right. This would be, the model here would be, they come in with sepsis, you give them this antibiotic cocktail, and they survive 3 days, let's say. And then at that point, you might do something else, but really just that initial sort of get over that hump of the first couple of days. So that you have time to actually culture the blood. Because once you can culture the once you can culture the bacteria, you can try anything you want on these things. And it's sort of a full information game at that point. Yeah.
So we assume all of the T patients are infected by the same bacteria.
No. That's actually very important that I do not assume that. Because what you want, the idea here is that it's kind of like you have a bunch of bugs here, different bacteria, and each antibiotic as a picture could cover some of those bugs. And what you're really trying to do is kind of like a set cover problem. You don't know which bug the person is coming in with, and it's going to be different bugs every day. So you're trying to find a combination of antibiotics that covers as many people as possible.
So there is somehow a distribution of bugs, and then we're trying to find a global outcome.
Very much so, yes. Yes, and this is very realistic. So the bugs that are in Madison are different than the bugs that are in Seattle, and this is a thing that actually changes over time. Yes.
I was wondering about if you're prescribing one antibiotic a lot, and then you start getting bugs that are resistant to specifically that. Like your earlier choices are influencing the bugs you see later on. How that would, as like the definition of regret you're using, seems like it would not.
That's a very subtle and careful point. Yes. That would be equivalent to an adaptive adversary, where the future sort of outcomes depend on what I did in the past. We are not going to assume that. We're going to assume an oblivious adversary setting, where basically all the outcomes with respect to all possible treatments I could have given were fixed in advance, and then I'm now playing this fixed sequence. That sequence could be adversarial, but it's not an adaptive sequence. You could do that. I mean, our bounds, you could apply an algorithm. I can prove a regret bound or an adaptive adversary. It just wouldn't have much meaning because it's a sort of a strange thing compared to the best thing in hindsight when it was an adaptive adversary, and the very definition of external regret doesn't make much sense. Great question. In that case, you'd want to more compete with like a natural equilibrium type concept, which we'll get to later. Good questions, by the way. You should keep asking. So we want to minimize regret. And so one of the first things you might do to solve this problem is you're trying to find some subset of size K. And the simplest algorithm you can imagine is just look at all n choose K subsets of the N antibiotics, treat each one as an individual, independent sort of treatment. So you have n choose K options, and then you run a multivariate bandit on top of this. And using any standard, your favorite multivariate bandit algorithm against an oblivious adversary, you can get a regret bound that scales like square root of n choose K times t. Okay. This is a bad bound in the sense that this is trivial unless big T, this horizon, is bigger than n to the K. Right? So this would be a not so satisfactory result because it would just take a very, very long, you're going to kill a lot of people before you actually converge to something that makes sense. And the way to think about these regret bounds, if you're not familiar with them, is you should think about sort of the long time progress of this thing. If you think about the average regret, as t goes off to infinity, you really want to scale this regret by 1 over t, because that's sort of your average loss that you're getting over time. And if that goes to 0, we say that's a no regret learn, because your average loss over time is going to 0, and you are competing with the best subset in hindsight. So you really want to get a sublinear regret bound, something like square root of t, which we have here, but that constant event choose k is just unacceptable.
I want to start a little bit in the story of the patient because I found it interesting. So in the external regret, the idea is that you choose your strategy and we will compare it with a constant agent. Like in the pattern setting, it is like I want to discover which funded, if I was following it by its own, will give me almost optimal value. I don't see why that is the case, like why that is a logical goal when I'm taking patients. Like,
well, it would be impossible to compare against the best treatment for each individual patient, because if I'm an adversary, I know what your algorithm is, and so what I'll do is I'll look at what you're going to assign to me, and then I will choose a different outcome, and I'll always get linear regress. Now, what would be unreasonable, but I take your point that it seems like a very poor baseline to compare to the single fixed cocktail in hindsight, because I'm saying things could change over time. This might not be the most meaningful benchmark. There exists more fancier algorithms that could be applied here that would be comparing to a moving target, adaptive regret. But I'm not going to go into those today. We can talk more offline about those algorithms. Trying to keep it as simple as possible. Yeah.
It's called a naive strategy, but is it really, can you actually avoid this issue without making further assumptions?
Great question. I'll get back to that in a second. So what we're going to assume is we're going to be I'm going to even simplify this further. I said before, all I really need is an oblivious adversary, which is true. The algorithms that we're going to use just occur oblivious adversaries, but I'm going to make an even simplifying assumption that it is going to be a stochastic function. This is not necessary for the analysis. It just makes it a lot easier to talk about in a talk. And so I'm going to assume that when patients are basically essentially drawn IID from a distribution, and that means that for there exists a fixed set function f, such that if I play a subset S, I'm going to get some reward that is IID, that is stochastic, with expectation f of s. Okay, so patients in the beginning act like patients in the end. But again, they come from this distribution. I don't know what this distribution is. The second assumption I'm going to make is that f is monotonically increasing. So that means if I have 2 antibiotics, if I add a third, I'm only going to kill more bugs. Okay, I'll show you in a moment that this is a very reasonable assumption. And the third assumption, which is going to do all the heavy lifting, is submodularity. So this is a mathematical notion of diminishing returns. The way to formalize this property that if I have one antibiotic, when I add a second one to the first one, I might get a big boost in performance. But if I have a collection of 10 antibiotics and add an 11th one, I'm not going to get that big of a boost. I'll still get a little bit of boost. 11 is still better than 10, but that relative difference between going from 1 to 2 is a lot bigger than going from 10 to 11. And that's what this submodularity property is capturing. The mathematical definition is stated here, but what I just said in words is all you really need to know for this topic.
Just kind of on the rewards, are they independent, or they just have there's any distribution? These patients could be some dependent process.
Well, for the purpose of this talk, let's say they're independent. But I will say that in the paper, this is not a necessary assumption. It could be a completely arbitrary thing. The only thing that would be important is that every time you show up, that person, even though we only get to try one cocktail on them, the assumption is that each function that they show up with is submodular and monotonic. So if I could somehow have this many worlds scenario where I could simultaneously try all subsets at the same time in many worlds, that function would be submodular. But for simplicity, let's assume it's just stochastic. Yes.
By the second assumption, that means we have no reason to choose less than k.
Great question. We'll get back to that. Anyone else? This is the right question to have. It turns out that that's not true. So one reason why I wanted to talk about this today, but I think it's really cool work, but another reason why I want to talk about this work today was because this is actually in a collaboration with a former postdoc of the Eric Wright. He worked just over there in one of these fishbowl labs. And he is interested in antibiotic resistance. He runs a lab at the University of Pittsburgh exactly on trying to find antibiotic cocktails to do this in the clinic. He has lots of experience in this. And he was kind enough to allow my student Jennifer Brennan to come join his lab for a couple weeks and do some experiments and collect lots of data with this great robotic platform that we used. And long story short, she was trying to find synergies in these antibiotic cocktails. Basically, 1 + 1 is, or like 2 antibiotics are better than the sum of their parts. That would be a synergy. There's some of this that was recognized in the literature as being possible. She came up with a very clever experimental design based on the physics or biology of bacteria and how they respond to the antibiotics. And we did lots of experiments, these very fancy experimental design to figure this out, to test the hypothesis. And we basically found absolutely no evidence of synergies in antibiotic resistance or in antibiotics, at least the ones that we tried. And because that's good, because that would actually contradict submodular behavior. 1 + 1 being greater than 2 would be the opposite of diminishing returns. And when we actually went and collected this data, we actually saw this very clear diminishing returns property. Now, what we're seeing here is the additional performance of adding 2 to 3 and 3 to 4 and 4 to 5. And what this is showing is that when I added 1 more to 2, that relative gain is decreasing over time, right? So this is the plot that's giving you evidence that's justifying the submodularity. Now, this is just a picture, but we can mathematically actually quantify this as well. And basically, a 99.9% of combinations submodularity for combining these combinations. So there's justification for why the submodularity property would hold. And intuitively, it is kind of like a covering problem in which is sort of an archetypal submodularity setup. Okay. So if we wanted to identify the optimal subset size K, and let's say I knew the function f, right? I had access to it. It was free. These aren't patients. These are just, I'm querying a database. How many queries would it take to find this optimal subset of size K? No noise, no stochasticity, no adversarialness. There's a fixed function. It's not hard to show at all that this is going to be at least NP hard, even if you assume submodularity. Even with these monotonicity and submodularity, I can still put a spike somewhere in these n choose k, where you basically have to check essentially all n choose k subsets to find the best. But this is, very worst case. There's a famous result by Nimhauser et al. That says that actually the greedy algorithm is a pretty good approximation. And basically, what it's saying is you start with an empty set, you add the single best element to that existing subset, you evaluate it, you add it to your set, and you repeat this process until you get k times. It's the simplest possible algorithm you can imagine for this problem, and it has this guarantee that basically it says that it's competitive, constant approximation competitive with the best set in hindsight. Okay, so if there's some set that achieves some super great accuracy or super great performance, if you do this very greedy procedure, which only requires order k queries, or order n times k queries, because there's k rounds, now you're making n queries. Instead of n choose k, you're only making n times k queries, but you get a great approximation ratio. Okay, so we're going to leverage this. And when we have this noise, again, I'm assuming the stochastic model, just for simplicity, the most natural algorithm you could think of, if you're getting this noisy stochastic outcomes, is just to pick some amount of measurements tau, and then at each time you're going to do the exact greedy algorithm, except for you're going to measure each outcome tau times, and then get the empirical means, and then use those as if those were true. And then repeat this algorithm. And then once you fill your set, you're then, for the remaining t minus tau k rounds, you're just going to play the best set that you found. This very simple procedure, okay, so I started with a regret minimization of comparing the best set, but because of this approximation ratio, I just showed you, or I just claimed that was a very hard thing to compare to. So the natural sort of fair comparison is to compare to the greedy set. And so I'm going to use this notion called greedy max, which is basically just saying I'm going to compare to the set that would have been created if I greedily built up the set. Okay, sometimes this corresponds to the real optimal set. Sometimes it doesn't, but that's my benchmark. I'm going to compare to that set that was created by greedily building up that set. And if I do that, Streeter and Golovin showed that in this, for this algorithm, for tau chosen appropriately, you can achieve a regret bound of k n to the 1/3 t to the 2/3. Okay, the dependence on n and k not super important, but the t to the 2/3 is really the important thing here. It's sublinear. It's growing sublinear in t, meaning that if I average out over t, this is going to 0. And so this is we are converging to the best greedy max outcome. And so to summarize what I've said so far, is that if I treat each of my n choose k subsets as an individual treatment, then I get this regret bound of n choose k t, or square root of n choose k t. And if I do this greedy sort of explore then commit type algorithm, I get this t to the 2/3 regret bound. And the interesting thing for us was twofold. One, if you're familiar with this, bandits and interactive learning, seeing t to the 2/3 often means that you are a lazy algorithm designer. It's very rare to see t to the 2/3. It's almost always square root of t just by, this is the parametric rate of estimation. T to the 1/2 is what you expect to see. T to the 2/3 is often wrong. And so what we really wanted to show was can you actually get down this n choose k? This is sort of the trivial algorithm, just take advantage of any structure. Can we come up with an algorithm that actually gets square root of t regret with a much, much better constant out front? And I should note that the best known lower bound prior to our work was actually square root of nt, which is far different than both of these, far, far, far smaller. And so what we showed, what our team showed, anyways, after trying for weeks to come up with a better upper bound algorithm, he spent, a night on trying to prove a lower bound, as I encourage all you students to do. After you spent a number of weeks trying to prove an upper bound, try to prove a lower bound or impossibility result. And he was able to do so. And he basically proved a lower bound that looks like this. What it says is the minimum over all L between 0 and k of these two bounds. And the intuition here is L is equal to 0. This term is dead. And you just have this, and this is the square root of n k times t. And if L is equal to k, this term is 0. And you just get the k n to the 1/3 t to the 2/3, which is exactly that other bound. And then for L somewhere in the middle, it's going to interpolate between these two bounds. And what you actually see here is that for t very, very large, for t much larger than n choose k, the minimizing L is going to be this term. And then for t very small, like t on the order of n, the minimizing L is going to be equal to k, and you're going to be suffering this term. And then somewhere in between, for different ranges of t, you're going to get the interpolation between these two. And once we saw this lower bound, we immediately knew what the upper bound algorithm was to achieve this. It's very simple. All you do is you find the L. These are all known quantities. So you find the L that you find the expression, and then you do the greedy then commit algorithm for exactly L stages. And then that leaves n choose k minus L remaining subsets that you have to discriminate between. And then you just make all of those an individual treatment, and you run a naive multi-band algorithm on that. And that achieves this. Very, very simple algorithm. The tough part about this was actually showing this lower bound. I was kind of facetious when I said he spent a night on it. He spent a night and got the general idea. Actually proving the full generality for full k was very difficult. But the main insight was that showing that this t to the 2/3 was tight for t small enough. And for the experts in the room, I just want to give you an intuition for where this t to the 2/3 regret comes from, because it's very rare. Like when t to the 2/3 comes up, it's something weird is going on with the problem, because we almost always see square root of t regret. And the intuition is that if for k equals 2, if you only use sets of size 1, you're trying individual antibiotics, you're in a bad situation in which, because of the monotonicity property, by adding a second one, you're only going to do better, right? But by doing individual ones, you're getting an enormous amount of information. Because if you try two items at the same time as a set of 2, you don't know which antibiotic was responsible for that big gain. It's an attribution problem. You don't know if you try 2, was it the first one or the second one that was doing the heavy lifting? And so while, yes, you get a better result, you're not getting as much information about what one is actually doing the heavy lifting, but if you're using sets of size 1, you're going to be getting high regret because you're potentially not getting the full benefit of using 2 antibiotics. However, if you did use subsets of size 2, there's n squared of them. There's way too many of them for you to do this feasibly. If your horizon t is order n, you're never going to have, you're just by enumerating them, you're never going to be able to get through them to have a non-trivial. And so what we do is we just make a construction such that it balances these two extremes, resulting in you having to suffer t to the 2/3. Because you have to conflict with this, basically, you have to pay for information. And that paying for information and where you know you're getting big regret at any instant, but you're getting lots of information, is what leads this t to the 2/3.
Yeah, maybe I'm jumping the gun here, but you're setting the adversarial setting, right? So how does that explanation phase even work? Because you don't
Yeah, so I purposely talked about the stochastic setting here because the algorithm is very simple. In the adversarial setting, it's much more complicated. Basically, you're playing a version of EXP3, but you're like constantly sort of evaluating, going back and trying like small sizes and big sizes of subset sizes. Like most of the time, you keep sort of building up this set slowly, but then every now and then, this randomly, you sort of like take out an element and try to reduce your size. And so because things can change over time, you have to sort of constantly backtrack. So it's a complicated algorithm to describe, but it's possible to work out. Okay, so we can solve this problem this way. It's great, it works. It's satisfying that we get this very simple algorithm out, and it's provably optimal if we hit this lower bound. And so what this work was is basically showing a new upper and lower bound that was tight and really interpolates between these two regimes. But getting back to the question of dosage, how would you
Can I ask you a question before you go to dosage? This is Jerry. So is there a best arm version of this if I don't care about regret? Hello?
Yeah, no, I'm thinking. Yeah, I haven't given that much thought. I think it would not be terribly interesting because there's no tension between information gain and regret. Because like you could play these small sets and it doesn't matter because it doesn't matter how many people you kill. You're just trying to identify what that best set is. And so I think actually you might run the same algorithm. No, you wouldn't run the same algorithm. You would just usually build up the set one at a time because there's no trade-off. You can do that and you're not suffering anything for doing that. Well, I don't know. Actually, I need to think about that. I've only thought about this in the regret framework, but it's a good question.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Does anything interesting happen if you relax the assumption that there's always positive or non-negative gains when you add an antibiotic?
Yeah, so you can. So there's submodularity, and then there's also a property called supermodularity, which is this property of if you give me peanut butter and jelly, that's better than each of them individually. So it's the opposite of submodularity. And it turns out that you can also efficiently optimize a function that is the sum of a submodular plus supermodular function for a slightly worse rate. So you can take that into account, yes. That can be handled. But it needs to be a submodular plus supermodular function, which is a far, far smaller class than the set of all set functions. If it's a set of all set functions, then it's intractable. Yes.
How does the hardness of the problem depend on k? So when k is 1, it's just a bandit problem. When k is n, then we don't need to really do anything. So it's trivial.
That's right. Yeah. So I mean, the hardness with respect to k is what you see here. This is how k shows up. For t very, very large, the minimizing L is going to be equal to 0, and so you're going to get n choose k times t, right? So that's going to be really bad. But if t is really small, like the order of n, then the minimizing L is going to be k, and it's going to be linear. So it'll be k n to the 1/3 times 2/3. So yeah, you just read it off. Next question right here.
Do you have any thought, especially in like the antibiotic resistance setting, of like penalizing the size? Like k is chosen beforehand, and you're allowed to pick anything up to k, and there's no real like penalty to picking k versus k minus 1 versus k minus 2.
Yeah.
Is there any thought to like, basically interpolating in some way there that like you have like larger subsets are worse by the fact that they're larger?
Yeah. So this is a great question. Basically, you can talk about this in terms of a multi-objective optimization, where you don't just measure whether it was successful or not, but whether what was the toxicity level at the end of the day. And then you can start talking about, well, what point on that Pareto frontier do you want to hit? And yeah, you can do that too, if you didn't want to commit to a subset size k. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
Any thought about the anytime version of this?
I mean, I'm going to punt and say you can do the standard doubling tricks and things like that. I've not given it much thought of having like a supernatural algorithm for that. It's a good question because, especially in the stochastic sort of greedy then commit algorithm, that's not going to work. You got to do something else. Questions? Yeah. So in the dosage setting, if you're going just for a single dose, and this would be like if you added 2 together, I'm just going to have half of each. If I did 4, I'm going to 1/4 of each or 1/3 of each. So the single scalar, sort of relative to the full amounts, then what you're really doing is you're observing this, whether that submodular function exceeds some that you're also setting, where C is that dosage level. And how do you optimize over a score and the subset directly? And this is interesting in antibiotics, but I kind of already mentioned that this is not actually that big of a problem. And where this does come up a lot more often is actually in bundled pricing. So if you're, pricing your Happy Meal, you need to have, you have to choose the subset, but then you also have to choose what price to sell it. Or you have your boots, skis, and poles, but then you also choose the price. And this comes up, of course, in table channels. This is sort of called a pure bundling problem. It's very evil because they don't let you buy a la carte. You have to buy the bundle. That's a very interesting setting. And then, of course, the Microsoft Office sort of suite. The bigger the packages you buy, the better the deal you get on average. And the reason why bundles are everywhere in pricing is because they give more opportunities of that price demand curve. And so basically, it's making the market more and more efficient because you're giving more consumers more choice over what they could do, and so their utilities go up. Yeah, and in all these problems, I can make a good argument that they're actually submodular. Each additional item, each additional hamburger is going to give me some more happiness, but it's diminishing returns after I've already eaten the whole hamburger. And so to understand, how we would do this optimal pricing, it's no other place to start than the classic work of Kleinberg and Enlightening, who really did a great job with this problem. And so the way that they modeled this is a seller would arrive. They have some cost. Never mind. Ignore the cost part. Let's say it's 0 cost for now. They're doing. We're just doing revenue. So he posts some price, PT, some price in 0.1. The buyer arrives. It's arbitrary valuation. So this could be adversarial. There's no assumptions on how this person's showing up. and they have some valuation 0, 1, and the seller receives the reward or the revenue of the price that they set, but only if the revenue exceeded that price. Okay, that's your 1 month. So if you put a price too high, the person didn't value it, you get 0 reward. If they valued it far more than the price, you only get the price that you set. And so if their valuation was far higher than your price, you screwed up. You could have set the price higher. And their main theorem, or one of their theorems in this paper, is there exists an algorithm that chooses PT at each time, such that the regret of how much profit or how much revenue I could have gotten with the best fixed price in hindsight versus the amount of profit or revenue that I actually got is bounded by t to the 2/3. And there's an interesting reason why this t to the 2/3 is not t to the 1/2. It specifically comes from the fact that the way that they prove this is they just grid the 0, 1 unit interval by t to the 1/3 prices. So the gap between any given price is t to the minus 1/3. And then they just play multi-term band it over these t to the 1/3 arms as if each price is in hindsight. Okay. And that's how they get this bound. And that t to the 1/3 is chosen to sort of optimize this two bounds of, because you're only playing against this finite grid, the optimal price could be on a continuum. And so the error you're going to make at any given time is at most t to the minus 1/3. You have t horizon, t times t to the minus 1/3 is equal to t to 2/3. It's exactly the regret you get here. Okay. So that's where the t to 2/3 comes in. In this case, it has to be from the fact that you're gridding the space. So that's great. And so we can actually adopt this same sort of strategy for the antibiotic problem, at least, where the customer arrives with now some unobserved set function, Vt. The seller assigns some subset, St, in 1 to n, such as bounded by k, and they choose a price. And then we receive revenue if they get that, we get that price if it exceeded that, if the valuation exceeded that price. And we have the same sort of regret framework here. And this really should be greedy max, not max. And the main lemma or claim that we had to prove in this work was that we need to somehow connect valuation functions to this reward function, this revenue function. And the way that we were able to do that is we proved a nice lemma, which says that if your set function is submodular and it's stochastic, such that it has a smooth density, that means that for any subset S, if I look at V of S, the random realizations of V of S, that has a smooth density, meaning it doesn't have atomic sort of like, with probably 0.1, it's equal to 0.3. It's a smooth density. If that's true, then almost surely we have that this function is also submodular. So if V is submodular and it's a smooth, it's coming from a stochastic distribution that's smooth, then P times probability of V of S greater than P is also submodular. And so this gives you a hint of what we're going to do. If we knew what the optimal price was, then we could just basically play this. We would just plug in that optimal price, and we play that at every single round. And then we just treat this as the submodular function that it is. And that'd be fine. But we don't know what the optimal price is in the beginning. So we have to actually do another round of sort of searching over these prices, which could hurt us a little bit. And so we get a slightly worse rate of 2 to 3/4. But it really is as simple as just, okay, I don't know what the optimal price is, so I have to grid that too. And I have to search over that, and I have to expand my search space. But it's really that simple.
Good question. So when k equals 1, does it also, is it covered by the previous work or no? Because now you have also selection and problem being solved together here. So if the
No, it's not.
When k equals 1,
well,
big prices as well as choose which one to stay for arriving customers. So is that are you also covering?
Oh, okay. So if it's k equals 1, then basically your action space is n cross prices.
Yes.
And so you could just grid the space with t to the minus 1/3 prices, and then play over your n arms.
I see.
So
Okay,
it would basically be the same algorithm, but you could probably get a much better rate than what we have here.
And when you say search over prices, you're doing that you're holding ST fixed for a while and finding the best price for ST? Is that?
We're actually doing it simultaneously.
Okay.
We're doing regret minimization over prices.
Yeah.
At the same time, we're doing regret minimization over sets. And you make an argument that eventually these things are both going to converge at the right rates.
Okay.
So using the greedy max there in your regret, is that because as part of your algorithm, you're using the greedy algorithm to pick the the observed rewards? Okay, so if your analysis, I'm assuming, is modular enough, so if I were to replace that with an exact optimization procedure, I could go ahead and replace it.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And in fact, so that lower bound that we constructed, I should have mentioned this, the greedy max is equivalent to that formula.
Okay.
And so that's how we try to produce lower bounds, because it's very hard to reason about what the greedy max is actually converging to. So we try to come up with instances which the greedy max is on. Okay, so that's great. We can directly apply the Kleinberg-Lake result, and we're all very happy. And this is when, basically this is effectively you coming to my store. I show you this bundle and a price, and you either buy it or you don't, right? And I solve that problem. That is not at all the gas station problem that I described to you. That's not how this works. You show up at the gas station, you get to choose between gas only, car wash only, or gas and car wash only. You go to a grocery store, there's a million SKUs there. You get to choose what you want to buy. You have different valuations over all these different products. And I have to assign prices to all these different products simultaneously. And then you make a choice. And so the real problem is actually something that looks like this. So I now have n items or n products. And now it doesn't actually matter if they're a bundle or not a bundle. You can imagine sort of like all possible products and all possible subsets of those products. And I can assign a price to them. I can assign a price of infinity so that, like, if a bundle doesn't exist, sort of not in this notation, but it's okay. So I have sort of n things that I need to price. I choose a vector of size n of all these prices. I then, a buyer shows up with a valuation VT, which is also valuations over all the items. And then what I get, the buyer then buys the product BPTVT. So this is an index in 1 to n. And you can assume, like, not buying something, that's one of these outside options. It's just like one of the items. So don't worry too much about that. They're always going to buy something. And then what I get is PT minus CT. So the price of that item minus the cost of that item to me, right? I have to introduce costs now, because now, unlike with pricing a single item, the cost for any price that I pay is the same. But now when I have multiple items, it matters what the costs are of these different items. And so the costs, we can say, are known. They can change over time, but they're known in advance. They're FT minus 1 measurable. And so what is this function, this choice function? And a very common one is just the best response function, right? I have these valuations over these items. I just choose the item I, or the buyer buys the item I, that maximizes the gap between how much I value it and the price of that item. Okay, very simple sort of response function. A very common function that's found in the literature everywhere is the BTL model, with a Combinatorial loose model. And what this is saying is, now I'm going to do something stochastic. I'm going to sort of score all the different items, and then I'm going to stochastically draw from this distribution to sort of this soft max sort of thing of these things. But of course, this is actually equivalent to the best response function if I were to draw WTs from a Gumbel distribution, and then add them to my valuations. That is completely equivalent to a best response function over my valuations plus a Gumbel. And so really what I'm doing is this BTL model is actually equivalent to a best response function where my VTs are stochastic. So both these models they're all just best response models with different populations of VTs coming to me. And so we're just going to focus on the best response model. This problem, to solve this, is known as the principal agent problem with adverse selection. And setting here is that we get to observe, the seller gets to observe what item you bought, but we never get to observe your valuations. Not of the item you bought, and certainly not the items you didn't buy. So it's completely, you had this information asymmetry where I don't know how much you're valuing these different items, but I do see what you have. And in this work, or in this section, we're absolutely going to assume nothing about the VTs. They can be adversarially selected, they can be whatever over time. I'm not making any assumptions about this at all, because Clymer and Enlightening didn't say anything. They didn't assume any behavior about how people chose things. And our big question here is, if I define regret as, you know, the amount of profit that I get, or the amount of profit in hindsight versus the amount of profit that I got, when is regret sublingual? When can I get a tractable, non-trivial guarantee on this problem? And so, again, this is one of those situations where we spent many weeks trying to prove an upper bound, a non-trivial upper bound on this quantity. And then Arnav, one of my students, spent you know, a couple of days and proved a lower bound, showing that it was possible. And so it is a very strong lower bound in the sense that it's very bad news. So what it says is, it says there exists valuations V1 and V2, so these two vectors. So there's just two types of customers. There's two. There's only one of two customers. And then there's 3 items, so at least n equals 3 items. And VT at each time is just a stochastic model. With 5.6, V1 shows up. With 5.4, V2 shows up. But the thing is, that as a seller, I don't know what V1 and V2 are. They could be anything. I know the seller. If I'm the seller, I know there's only one of 2 possible customers that are coming to me, 2 customer types, but I don't know what those valuations are. And in that case, then the regret has to scale at least linearly with t, for some constant t, like 0.2 or something. And this is very strong in the sense that, like, I could do this with just 3 items. There's just 2 kinds of buyers. Is a very sort of easy, we would think, an easy setting. And so this was really surprising to us. I didn't actually believe it before I saw the proof. And in the intuition, though, it makes a lot of sense in hindsight. So if you think about the Clymer and Enlightening result, why that was possible was because they could price, they could grid the prices, and they know that the optimal price is within t to the minus 1/3 of the optimal price, right? The optimal grid price. And so basically, they're always sort of close. The optimal price can't like hide anywhere. But for n greater than or equal to 3, something funny happens. You can actually set these V1 and V2 such that if you price the first item, P1 less than or equal to tau, for some threshold tau, then only agent 1 gives you revenue. And if you set P1 greater than tau plus epsilon, then only agent 2 gives you revenue. But if you set the price of P1 between tau and tau plus epsilon, then both of them give you revenue. That's the optimal play to get as much reward as possible. However, I can set epsilon as small as I want, and that means that it would take an infinite amount of time for you to actually find what that price is. You'd have to just keep searching for what that interval is. I can hide the price in this arbitrarily small interval that you'll never find. You'll get linear regret. And the reason for why this is possible and why this doesn't come up in the Clymer and Enlightening result is because small changes in my price can change the behavior of the other agents. So if I change my price just a little bit, what happens is suddenly the choice of the other user over these 3 items flips from one item to the next item, and my costs on that other item could be considerably different. And so what's happening is a small change in price results in a large change in my overall profit. And so it's a very, very non-smooth function that I'm trying to optimize, and so I can hide something that's very, very small.
So if the cost for all equal, if all 0, then this will happen, or is it? So it seems very unintuitive that lower price would not.
Yeah, so I forgot to put that here. The costs are necessary. You need to have this sort of like, if they switch, I get this dramatically worse outcome. Okay. And so this is for 2 buyers, 2 kinds of buyers, and 3 kinds of items. And it's critical that there's actually 2 buyers to make this work. If there's just a single buyer, you can actually get sublinear regret very easily. Because if there's a single buyer, you can imagine a very simple algorithm. You set all prices at infinity except for 1, and then you do binary search on that one price. Basically, you can just move that price up and down until you figure out exactly what the valuation is of that item, and you just repeat this for all the items. And so this will take order n samples, and then you found out what their valuation function is, and you can optimally price it. So it's critical to have more than you have some heterogeneity in prices, or sorry, heterogeneity in users, buyers. Also, if you assume that the set prices is finite, then you can just treat this as a bandit, and then you can also get a sublinear regret rate on this problem. And this doesn't contradict the lower bound, because what was going on there is that you can't just grid the space of prices. That's what the lower bound says, because I can make this arbitrarily small sort of interval. And you might say, oh, well, maybe this lower bound is just really, really brittle. And in some sense, that's true, because like we don't talk about buying things in fractions of cents. Usually prices are down to the cent. But we really wouldn't want to try to grid all these prices up to every cent, because that would just be this cardinality P would be very, very large. And so we don't have all bad results. We also have positive results. And one of them is if we know there is a finite set of buyers, so buyer types. If we know there's a finite set of these things, and we know what they are, we know what the valuations are, then what you can do is there exists an algorithm that scales like just the cardinality of the number of buyers times root t, and this is optimal. Meaning I can come up with a situation in which this is absolutely necessary. And this is actually very intuitive, and it's reasonable from a situation like in a bar. Like maybe I can guess that Rob is going to go for Pilsners. Steve only drinks Fosters, of course, and so I can just guess what the different types are in the room of customers, and then grid appropriately over these different kind of buyers. And finally, our last result is if the decision function is smooth, because that's really what's going on. That's the problem with the lower bound that's exposing. If I do small changes in my price, drastic changes in behavior can occur. So if I just assume that away, if I just say, no, there's some Lipschitz property here. If I change prices by a very small amount, the behavior of what item the person's choosing can't change very much, then everything becomes good. And the intuition here is that like you cannot hide prices in a small little interval in this case. You're dithering sort of this decision function. So if it was a tiny interval, this amount of stochasticity is sort of like putting a hump there. And so you get, even if you're not hitting it exactly, you're still learning something. And the proof of this is a pretty standard sort of zooming algorithm of you grid and you use adaptive gridding.
And use it t to the 2/3 or t over log t or what?
It's pretty bad. It's like t to the d over d plus 1, I think. It's exponentially bad. Sorry, n.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really bad because you're basically gridding over prices.
Version of the assumption that works if your valuations are discrete, so you have discrete types of buyers and know that the valuations always form discrete way. Again, you won't have Lipschitz, but
so I mean that would be this case if you know what those valuations are, that would be this result. If you know what the valuations are, but if you don't know what the valuations are, then you're back to the lower bound because this is just two valuations. And so that's basically all the results I want to talk about today. There's many sort of open problems with this. So I propose sort of two very natural settings where there's a finite set of buyers and I know what they are. Okay, that's pretty unrealistic. And then also the smoothness condition, which seems reasonable on its face until you realize that people are not smooth with prices. They really do determine 99.99 is different than 100. And so they're not actually that smooth in some cases. And so coming up with tractable models that you can provably say are okay, but are flexible enough to be real world, that actually match realities. And also I studied the case where you get to observe what action they took, but not their valuation. There's another case of here where you only get to partially observe their action, which is a very interesting case for advertising. So if you show me a web ad and you don't know what I did with that information, you don't see what I did. Did I see that advertisement and go tell all my friends about this really cool product that I saw? Or did I do nothing and go, there's a partial observability of what my action is, and can you do the same sort of pricing problem? And thank you for your attention.
Since it's 1-3, I'll keep it and take off, but if people